there, friends and sane persons. My name is Kyle. It's Wednesday, which means it's time for another installment of Wednesday Whimsy. I hope you're excited. I sure am. I'm wearing my fighting tardigrade fez today because today we're talking about combat systems in board games. If you've not joined before, or of course, even if you have, doesn't matter. Wednesday Whimsy is a short show I do every Wednesday, where I talk about a board game adjacent topic. Sometimes it's about a game itself. Sometimes it's a list of ranking games, top 10, however I want it. And sometimes, like today, it's something that's related to games, but not necessarily about a specific game. I kind of came up with the idea of this topic when I got a new game that had just such an interesting way to resolve combat in the game. And I thought, I should make a list of my favorite combat mechanisms in games. And I made a long list, and I've kind of winnowed it down to 10 entries, because top 10 should have 10 entries on it. But this isn't a definitive list, and I might, change my order at any time based upon what game I'm playing and how much I'm loving it. But that's okay. So because we're not talking about a particular game, I might show some pictures or images from some games, and I will talk about some games where a mechanism kind of shows up, but it might be an unusual list. But anyway, we've listened to me kind of preface this list long enough, so let's go ahead and get started with talking about my number 10 combat mechanism in board games. My number 10 is a very popular mechanism. It's very memorable. Everyone kind of remembers the first time that they've seen it, and that is the cube tower. It was probably it's probably best known from a game called Wallenstein, or I guess there was a Japanese one, Shogun. Let's see if I can find a picture of that. So the way this works is there's this tower, and there are cubes in this tower, and the tower has various levels in it, so that not everything that you drop in will come out right away. And so over time, when it's time to resolve a combat, you're going to take, let's see if we can find a picture here. You're going to take a number of cubes based upon what you're doing, drop them in, and then whatever comes out, that's going to determine the result of the combat. And the interesting thing about this is that the cubes are going to stay in. So, I might drop in a whole bunch of red cubes now, but they might not show up until later. It's very unpredictable. Most of the time, everything drops out, but there's just enough randomness in how things get stuck and lodged in there and then eventually dislodged that makes it a very interesting and engaging mechanism. It's used in combat. It's also used in a variety of other ways, including, I don't know, there was an auction game that kind of used this. I've seen it for action selection, a lot of different ways to use this cube tower, but combat is definitely an interesting way to do it. And it's kind of easy to see the result because it's really just going to be whichever color is the highest. Now, it can be unsatisfying in a game with more than one, with combat where there's people who are not involved, because it might knock somebody else's cubes out. And if they're not going to gain anything out of the combat, well, then, it kind of feels like, okay, I sacrificed something going in to a previous round in hopes that I would get something better out later. And now I came out in an unrelated event. But, there's a lot of different ways to do it. I really enjoy the cube tower. It's not my favorite by any means because they are kind of difficult to set up and store, and also they can be kind of fragile. If you bump the table, it can dislodge something and result in a bad result, and it's kind of difficult to unwind, unlike, for example, a die roll, which you can just re-roll. But I do enjoy the cube tower, and so that's why it is my number 10. Let's move on now to number 9. So number 9 is I don't really know how to there's not really a term for this, but I refer to it as knockout dice. So this is the combat system that's used in a game called Dwellings of Eldervale. And in it, you're going to take all the dice that are involved in the combat, you're going to roll them, and you're going to compare highest with highest with highest. and whoever has the highest die. So let's say there was you rolled a 6 and a 4 and a 1, and I rolled a 6 and a 3 and a 2. Well, the sixes would cancel each other out, so we look at the next highest die, and your 4 beats my 3, so you therefore win the combat. It's an interesting way to resolve it, because it means that it doesn't really matter. You always have a chance, right? I can roll just one die with a 6 and win the combat against your 6 dice that all rolled a 2. So the absolute value of the combined value of all these dice doesn't really matter. What matters is whoever has the highest at any one moment in time. It can be a little unsatisfying if you're unlucky. It's also, ironically, it's the combat system that's really used in Risk if we go all the way back there. But I find the way that it's implemented in Dwellings of Eldervale to be more desirable, just because I don't know, it feels a little bit faster. Anyway, I don't know that I can't think of a lot of other games that this is used in, but Dwellings is definitely one that I've been playing a lot recently and that I find really enjoyable, and it just kind of feels fresh, even though it's really simple. And a good simple combat mechanism is always a good one to have, because it's going to be easy for everybody to understand and implement. And also, it kind of always gives you a sense of hope. So anyway, that's my number 9, the knockout dice mechanism in Dwellings of Eldervale. Let's move on to number 8. Okay, my number 8 is the one I was talking about earlier. It might actually go up in my estimation. I just haven't seen it in a lot of games. And this is the game, it's this chit poll mechanism that was used in a game called Intraveng Legends. So in Intraveng, and let me see if I can find a picture of it. I don't know if I'll be able to. Let me tell you, it was not an easy thing to figure out from the rule book. When I eventually talk about that game, I will have something to say about the rule book. But what you have is you have a bag of these little chits. They're called runes, I guess. And you're going to be pulling them out of the bag in sets of 3. So, you can pull out 3, decide whether to keep going or not. And you're going to be drawing a number of cards. You have kind of 4 cards that you'll draw at the start of every combat. And it's a deck of 8, so you're going to see, I guess I can't see a picture. Well, that's unfortunate. But these cards have a number of symbols on them, like it might say. So there's a red, a blue, a green, and a gray. And my card might have a red and then either a blue or a gray. And so I'm trying to fill in my cards with these runes that I pull out. Now, anything that does not fit on a card goes onto this miss track. And if you get to a certain point, if you have only 1, 2, or 3 misses, then you get to resolve certain positive abilities. If you get 4 misses, then you get to resolve no special abilities. You just resolve the cards. And if you get 5, you have to stop drawing at that point. And then you're going to have some negative abilities that you're going to resolve. But what it means is, you sort of have this interesting push your luck mechanism as you're pulling these chips out. And obviously, as you cover things up, the window of opportunity is going to get smaller, because you're going to have more misses as you have fewer spaces. You're kind of building this pool on your of your character in your little bag, and you're kind of resolving that with your abilities. And as you upgrade the abilities, maybe they become easier to fill. But it's just a really interesting mechanism. It's not one that I'd ever seen. Now, there are other games that you pull a chit out of a bag, like what is that game? I don't know, my mind, Arkham Horror, the LCG, or Arkham Horror 3rd Edition, right? Where you have a bag with these tokens in it, you'll pull one out, and it might modify your result. But this one in Intraveng is a little bit different, just because all you're doing is pulling things out and trying to fill these cards. And then as you fill the cards, you'll either, resolve them or not, based upon how successful you were. And then there are these bonuses that kind of get added to it. I found it to be a really fresh and interesting mechanism. I just wish the underlying game were a little bit better. But the combat just was so fresh and unique that it really kind of stuck with my mind, and I'd love to see it in a more developed game. So that's my number 8, the chit poll with mistrack, I guess, that was in Intraveng Legends. Let's move on to number 7. My number 7 is a grid fill mechanism. Now, again, I kind of am naming these myself, but the one that immediately comes to mind when I think of it is a game called Sleeping Gods. So in Sleeping Gods, you have these, when you get into a combat, which happens with some regularity, you're going to have these enemy cards that have, and I can show a picture of these here because I've actually found some. Let's go over here. So you'll have these enemy cards, and they have a variety of stats on them. You have their attack value and their defense, but when you successfully get enough damage to do damage, you're going to pick a spot to start in, put a damage token, and then every subsequent damage token you place as part of that attack is going to go up, down, left, or right from those, and the cards are going to be next to each other, so you might be able, for example, to do damage to this skeleton, which has lower defense, but spill some portion of the damage over onto the Titanic centipede in this case, because it has a higher defense, but you can kind of cheat some damage in that way. It's a really interesting way to deal the damage because you've got a lot of control over it. And I always like when you've got a lot of control. Now, I haven't seen this in a non-cooperative game. I don't know how thrilling it would be in a competitive game if you were doing that, but I found it to be a really interesting way to do things in Sleeping Gods. There's another game that I like a lot that it's not quite the same, but it's, I guess, similar, and that is One Deck Dungeon. In One Deck Dungeon, though, I can't see if I can spell. In One Deck Dungeon, you have dice that you're rolling, and you're trying to fill certain spots on grids with different die results. And so it's kind of similar, but I prefer the way that it kind of was implemented in Sleeping Gods, just because you got all this control. In one deck, you can decide whether you're going to combine dice. Like, for example, this Phoenix here, you'd have to have a total of 17 among any number of dice to put in this spot, whereas in this spot, you would only need a 6, but it'd have to be exactly a 6. And so you've got some agency there as you're deciding how to allocate your dice. And I like that, but I really loved in the Sleeping Gods way of doing it, where you had sort of deciding how this damage was going to go and deciding where to start. You might start on a bad spot, a spot that's not all that useful, but do that so that you could spread it out and get things in different spots. I just really enjoyed this combat grid, and I would love to see more of it. So that's why it is my number 7. Let's go on now to number 6. Hopefully. All right. My number 6 is what I'm going to call a card bid mechanism. I don't really know how else to call it, but what I'm thinking of when I mention this is like what's in the game Unmatched. So you're going to have cards, and the cards are going to do some level of damage, and you are the attacker is bidding a card to do something, and then the defender is going to respond, if desired, by bidding a different card, and then you're going to resolve any special abilities on them. Let's say I've got a picture of this here. You're going to resolve any special abilities at that point, and then damage will ultimately be determined based upon the difference between these values. So, for example, if I played this 4 and you played a 2, well, I have a net of 2 damage that's going to go through to you. Obviously, this is a strange example since this is one character's deck, but each character has its own deck, and some of them do a lot of damage. Some of them have effects that do a lot of damage. Some of them do damage a little bit as kind of a feint, and then there's a big one that comes in after that. It's just an interesting way of kind of bidding with the damage you're going to do. Very deterministic, no real randomness, other than kind of trying to outthink what your opponent has, use your effects to your ability, to their best ability, and really have a lot of choices and a little bit of mind games as you're playing this kind of a card bid damage mechanism. There's another game that kind of does it in a different way, and that is the game Blood Rage. In Blood Rage, you're not really bidding for damage, but you're bidding to win the combat. So everybody will play a card face down into this fight, and then you'll reveal those values, resolve some special effects, and then add the value of the cards you played to uh, to the value of your units in the fight, and then whoever has the highest total value is going to win the combat. Not quite the same, but it is sort of the same kind of concept of a card bidding, and I enjoy both of those. I like the sort of sense of control that you have as you're determining whether you want to go high, go low, win big, or whether look, I want to save my important, powerful cards for a time when it's more important. And so it's a really interesting way to kind of give you a lot of choices to make decisions and influence the combat in your favor. That's my number 6, the card bid mechanism, particularly from Unmatched. Let's move on to number 5. All right, my number 5, this is a weird one. I'm going to call it Dexterity, and I'm thinking of 2 games in particular here. Now, I really love this way of resolving combat. In terms of how fun it is, it might even be my 1 or 2. But the problem is that this kind of a dexterity level of resolution kind of takes over the game and becomes really the entire game. And as I'm talking about this, I'm thinking in particular of a game called Dungeon Fighter. Let's see if I can find a picture of Dungeon Fighter. So in Dungeon Fighter, oh, there's the new version. In Dungeon Fighter, what you have is this, you have a target that's on the table, and you are going to be, I'll show this picture of some people I don't know playing the game. Let's see, here we go. So in Dungeon Fighter, you have this target that's on the table, and that looks like a prototype version. And what you're trying to do is to roll and bounce dice so that they land in certain parts of the target, because they'll do, well, here's a better picture. So for example, if you were to get a die that landed in this 2 section, it's going to be 2 damage, but there are ways that you can increase that. There's a symbol on the die, and if it's face up, then maybe it doubles the value. There are, of course, some miss areas, and you're kind of using the dexterity of how you throw the dice. It's increased in sort of some zaniness by these other effects. So, for example, you can use a weapon that requires you to throw the dice in a special way. Maybe you have to close your eyes. Maybe you put the die in somebody else's hand and kind of use yours to make them throw it. There's a variety of different dexterous elements that are going to come in, and it's a very zany way to play a game. Again, I find it very fascinating, and it's a lot of fun, but it's really the game at that point. You're not really doing anything else. It's difficult to combine sort of a lighthearted dice bouncing type of a mechanism with a serious game. And so that's why maybe it's not my number 1. There's another game that does it, which is called Catacombs. And in Catacombs, essentially what you're doing is you're taking discs and you're flicking them at your opponent's discs. And when they hit, that's going to do damage. Also, really, that takes over the game. It becomes the disc flicking game, not, a disc flicking element in another more serious game. And that's totally fine. If that's the game you want to play, it's a lot of fun, and I love it. That's why it's my number 5. It just doesn't necessarily mix well with other games. And so that's why maybe it's not my absolute favorite, but I really do have a fun time with it. That's the dexterity element in both Catacombs and Dungeon Fighter. Let's move on now to number 4. All right, my number 4 is a mechanism I will call the combat deck. Now, this is partially in Sleeping Gods, but really when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking of Gloomhaven. So in Gloomhaven, you have a deck of combat cards, and when you do damage, you've got some damage that's being done, and then you're going to flip over the top card of this deck, and it will modify the damage that you're doing in some way. I mean, and it could be a variety of ways. There's some ways where you just automatically miss. There's some ways where you do double the damage. Or there's a +1, a -1. It can add in some elements because, of course, the game is all about customizing your character and building up your own particular deck in a variety of ways. And for some reason, I can't seem to find a picture of it, but that's okay. What it does is it allows you to have these interesting moments of kind of controlled randomness. You never know exactly what's in there, or what's on top of the deck, but you kind of know the composition. You know there's always one wild miss card. There's one or more of these doubler cards, and then you've kind of tweaked your deck a little bit by throwing in some, getting rid of some of those minuses, adding some bigger pluses. And so you can kind of have a little bit of randomness. You kind of know your base amount of damage from your ability, but you're going to move it up or down based upon the card that's on top of the deck. I find it to be really an interesting way to do it. Sleeping Gods kind of has that as well. We talked about sort of their grid mechanism, but in addition to the way you get to the damages, you're going to flip over the top card of a Fate deck and add it to your weapons damage. And so it's kind of the same type of a thing. Although with that game, the real combat is that grid that you're filling in. In Gloomhaven, really, it's just, you're doing damage to the enemies. And once you've resolved the card, it's over and done with. But it can lead to some interesting swings and interesting moments, and it can be very fascinating as you kind of upgrade it and customize it yourself. So I really enjoy having a separate combat deck that's going to add some variety to the game. Another game that does it is one that we're going to talk about in just a moment. But well, I guess we'll talk about it in just a moment when we get there. So let's get there and move on to number 3. Move on to number 3. So my number 3 is another new game that's come out recently that's been really interesting to me. Did I spell it right? I did not. Let me just spell it correctly. So my number 3 is, so there's a game called Oathsworn that has come out recently. That doesn't look right. Well, we'll play spelling with Kaya. Are there 2 H's in there? No, there's just one. All right. So let me edit that again. I apologize. I should have done better. There we go. Thresholds. So in the game Oathsworn, you have, and that's why I kind of mentioned it with the combat deck. So the way you get to your damage in Oathsworn is you've got this deck of cards, and they have different values. Like there's the white, which are your weakest, and you've got the blacks, which are going to be your highest values. And so as you go through the game, when it's time for you to attack, you'll draw as many white cards as you want, and then you can also add in some reds, yellows, and blacks based upon the resources that you're able to spend or the weapons that you're using. And you're kind of flipping them over, and then if you have 2 misses, you miss, plain and simple. But if you don't, then you're going to do all that damage. But, and this is why I call it a threshold, each enemy has a defense value. So you might be fighting the very first scenario, you're fighting this giant rat. And the giant rat has, I don't know, I think it was a 2 defense value. It means that every instance of 2, so if let's say I did 11 damage, I'd divide that by 2, right? And so that would be 5 damage, we'd round it down. I'd have done 5 instances of damage. And then, you're trying to break these various pieces of the enemy by doing enough damage with the threshold, by hitting that threshold enough times that you're able to, to reduce these damage dice to 0. It's a very interesting way to do it. It also has I don't love when there's a role for defense in games. You won't see that on my list, just because it can be really frustrating if you do a really good turn and then your opponent has another really good turn and they kind of cancel each other out. But in this game, I like it because there is some defense. There's sort of a threshold you're trying to meet. And if you're able to do it, you're going to be successful. And so it's just a very interesting and satisfying way to kind of address the issue of defense by having you do certain instances of a particular number of damage. And it can also make the enemy more difficult by simply increasing that threshold. That means, of course, you have to hit it that much harder. And so it becomes a decision of how hard you're going to go at one particular attack, knowing that you can also miss. But I don't know. I just found it to be a really interesting way to do it. There are some other games where you'll see that in there as well, but Oathsworn's the one I've been playing the most lately, so that's the one I thought of. Let's go on to number 2. All right, my number 2 is good old-fashioned dice, but particularly dice with symbols. Now, uh, I know that's not very specific, but I'm thinking in particularly of a game called Summoner Wars, and I mean the new Summoner Wars, second edition. The way that you do combat in that game is you're going to roll a number of dice, and then based upon whether the dice are whether the attack is a melee attack or a ranged attack, you're going to be looking for a particular symbol on those dice. So, for example, the sword, anytime a sword comes up, that's going to be a success for a melee attack. Anytime a bow comes up, it'll be a success for a ranged attack. And there's also this magic symbol, which has other effects based upon the different cards that are in the game. I like that because it's very easy to understand and to explain. Dice can be used in combat a lot of ways, and it could be like, you add up the totals and divide like we do with the threshold, or my total minus your total. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but I like the symbol because it's just so easy to understand. Another game that does a really good job with it is a game that I haven't played in forever, but one that I really enjoyed back in the day. It has some issues that caused me not to want to play it as much anymore. But Memoir 44, and I'm wondering, so we have these dice in Memoir, and you would simply look at the target. For example, if I were attacking a soldier, I would be looking for soldier dice. Whereas if I were attacking a tank, I'd be looking for the tank dice, and then this grenade was an automatic hit. So it made it very easy to kind of decide, you could look at the dice and in an instant know how well you had done in a particular combat. Sorry, I have a bit of a cough. All right. Too much talking. So I really enjoy these dice with symbols. There's another symbol that you kind of see in some games, and that's the exploding dice symbol that also kind of, it's almost its own mechanism, which I thought about putting on here, but ultimately I kind of like some of these other ones better. But, you would roll this symbol, and if you did, then you could roll dice again because it gives you an extra, it's a success plus an extra die roll. But it's another kind of a symbol, but that's not quite what I'm talking about here. I'm more talking about specific symbols that are going to reference either the target, so you can immediately see if you hit it, or your method of attack, which also allows the game to adjust the probabilities of different types of attacks or different types of targets without getting into a complex system, a lot of math or a combat table or anything like that. So that's my number 2, dice with symbols. Let's go on to number 1. All right, my number 1 combat system, and I don't know, it's one that I haven't seen in a lot of games, but this is the combat system that you would see in particular, I think, of 2 games. The first of them, though, and the one that immediately comes to my mind because it was the best implementation of it, is Rising Sun. And it's the bidding mechanism, the bidding kind of almost like an auction. I don't love auctions, but the bidding mechanism that's in the Rising Sun combat. It also shows up in a game called Cry Havoc, although it's implemented differently. In Cry Havoc, it's a very open bid, whereas in Rising Sun, it's a private bid. But what you have, and I don't know why I can't find a picture of it, is you have this little board, and you have it behind your screen, and there's a number, I think there's 5 different spots you can bid to, and they're going to resolve in order, left to right, and whoever bids the most on each of these various actions is going to get to perform the action, and whoever does not win is not going to get to perform the action. So, for example, there's one of them which was just win the combat, right? I mean, it's not quite what it was, but you're going to have some strength. Like, for example, there's one that's capture your opponent's piece, take your opponent's piece out of combat. There's one that is kill your own pieces and score points for them. There's one that, that kind of goes into the actual value of the combat. And then there's, you kind of resolve the strength of the units on the board. and I might be getting that wrong because it's been a little while since I played the game. And then there was another one where you would actually score points. That's what I'm thinking of. Score points from the combat based upon the number of units that were killed in the battle. And so you kind of have some information going into it, right? You're required to disclose how much money you have and how many of these Ronin things, that's what I was thinking of, these Ronin units, which can add to your strength if you win their section of the combat board. So you know how much your opponent has, and you can see how much strength your opponent has in the combat, and you can kind of make informed decisions of okay, I think that they don't really care about this one. They're not going to get much out of it if they win. So, maybe I don't have to invest heavily into the actual combat itself, and I can kind of mess on the fringes with killing my pieces and getting points for them. Or, you might think, well, okay, but maybe they know that I'm going to do that, so I'm going to do it differently. And then to make things a little bit more interesting, the person who ends up winning the combat has to take the money that they spent on the combat and divide it among the losing players, which is, an interesting way to make sure that people are always involved. It's never too late. You could have no money, but lose one combat and you've got a lot of money. And then the money goes away at the end of the round, so you're entirely incentivized to spend it. Cry Havoc did it slightly differently. There was a board, and it had, just like Rising Sun, it had a number of actions, and you could bid your pieces from the combat into those areas. The biggest problem with that is that, it kind of became, it was sort of watching the outthinking process going, and I liked it. I thought it was a lot of fun, but there was sort of a propensity for ties in that game. And as the defender, I think you won the tie. I couldn't remember if the defender or attacker wins the ties, but it could be, a tie is always unsatisfying in a game. And I just found that the Cry Havoc mechanism kind of had a propensity to result in them. Whereas, while it can definitely happen in Rising Sun, the way that you influence the ties is a separate mechanism of the game. So I found it a little bit more enjoyable even when those occur. Anyway, I really like this way of kind of procedurally resolving different aspects of the combat through bidding, and it's all based upon information that was open at the beginning, and it's just the different allocations that are going to be a surprise, and then you kind of see how it happens and how it all plays out. Anyway, that's my current favorite combat mechanism. Now, again, any day of the week, if you asked me, I might change my mind. And there's, surprisingly, even after so many years, there are new combat mechanisms that are just coming out. Like I said, Intraveng really surprised me with this kind of chip, pull, and miss track. I thought I'd seen it all, but when it came out, I was really excited and enjoyed the game more than I probably should have, just because of that interesting and innovative method of combat resolution. Anyway, I've kind of droned on a bit here now, so I'm going to bring this to a close. But I hope you've enjoyed the discussion on combat mechanisms. If there's something I missed, look, I only had room for 10. Go ahead and put it in a comment. I'd love to see what you're thinking about combat resolution. And join us again next week, where we're going to talk about another board game related topic. Until then, I wish you safe travels, courage when you need it, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.